Welcome to The Last Climb. Today we're looking at a young climber with a strong gym reputation in a commercial expedition who stepped away from fixed ropes to attempt a steep Himalayan face.
Confident in his gym grades, he brushed off experienced climbers who warned that the route was far more complex than it appeared on paper. Knowing how it ended, it's hard not to think about how quickly things can slip past the point where turning back is still simple. It was the 13th of September 2015 when a marked climbing itinerary, a pair of mountaineering boots, an ice axe, and a set of crampons were arranged across a table inside a small guest house room in Kathmandu and photographed beneath the overhead light. By the following morning, the image had already circulated among climbers at a local gym in Las Vegas who understood exactly which mountain the equipment pointed toward. Malachi Hermo was 28 years old and worked as a lead instructor at an indoor climbing gym in Las Vegas, where he had developed a reputation that went beyond simply being talented on the wall. He was intensely competitive, openly dismissive of caution from climbers he viewed as less capable than himself, and increasingly convinced that most people in the local climbing scene overcomplicated risk because they lacked confidence in their own ability. Over the previous several weeks, he had talked about a line on the Lhotse face of Everest, a massive wall of ice and rock leading toward the South Pole. More and more, even after multiple experienced climbers told him he wasn't ready for it. He didn't really take those warnings as advice in the usual sense. They seemed to land more like a challenge to him, like something he had to prove wrong. When people brought up his lack of high-altitude experience and fixed-rope systems training, he returned to a single comparison. He climbed 5.12 indoors. In his view, the technical difficulty of the upper sections outweighed what he considered logistical concerns, which he treated as secondary rather than defining factors of the climb. His social media reflected the same mindset. The account was built around projecting progression, difficulty, and fearlessness training clips, steep gym ascents, summit photos, gear shots, and captions about pushing limits.
I think most people in that space don't really say it out loud like that unless they're trying to convince themselves to.
Malachi had spent years building an image of himself as someone naturally gifted enough to skip the long learning curve other climbers accepted as necessary. The planned climb fit perfectly into that image. By that point, the mountain itself had become secondary. What mattered to Malachi was proving that the people warning him were wrong. The route involved a sustained approach through the western CWM, followed by a long alpine section that gained significant elevation into the steep blue ice and mixed terrain of the Lhotse face. Though considered a serious, high-altitude objective due to its exposure, altitude, and objective hazards, it was widely regarded by experienced climbers as unsuitable for inexperienced solo attempts because the difficulty extended far beyond individual movements. It required advanced acclimatization, route finding across technical ice, and the ability to retreat safely in changing mountain conditions. Malachi reduced the climb almost entirely to its perceived difficulty. In gym conversations, he framed it as a simple comparison. He climbed 5.12 indoors, so a moderate ice face should not present a serious problem.
I've heard this kind of comparison before, and let me honestly it never really holds up once you're actually out there. Rock gym strength doesn't translate cleanly to altitude and ice.
He chose to climb the route unroped, avoiding the established fixed lines, treating the lower section as non-technical terrain based on gym-based comparisons. Experienced climbers warned him about the Lhotse face, where safe travel depends on managing heat and reading subtle ice changes. From the glacier floor, the surface can appear deceptively uniform, and route finding relies on following the established corridor rather than wandering onto steeper, unroped sections One climber with multiple Himalayan expeditions added that even experienced teams can misjudge the commitment required on the steep ice, and once committed, retreat without a rope can become impossible to manage safely. Malachi dismissed these warnings, interrupting explanations, laughing off concerns, and treating caution as insecurity. The more experienced climbers tried to correct him, the more convinced he became that the risk was overstated. In the weeks leading up to the attempt, his plan started to escalate. At the same time, things shifted at the gym where he worked. He'd applied for a head instructor role but didn't get it. They gave it to someone younger, instead less technical experience, but a stronger high-altitude background.
I don't know. That kind of thing tends to stick with people more than they'll admit. And around that point, I noticed the solo attempt wasn't just something he'd bring up casually anymore. It started coming up more often, more directly, like it had moved from idea to something he actually wanted to prove.
In the weeks that followed, coworkers consistently described a change in his behavior. His previously occasional references to a solo attempt became more frequent, more specific, and more public. He began naming the Lhotse face directly in conversations, mentioning it during instruction sessions, and posting about it on social media with increasing clarity.
What had once been a distant idea became something I heard him speak about as a near-term objective.
The tone shifted from aspiration to fixation. By late August and into September, it was no longer framed as something he might do, but something he intended to do soon. On the evening of September 13, Malachi packed a 20-liter Alpine day pack for the following morning. Inside were minimal essentials: a 2-liter hydration bladder, 2 energy gels, a light fleece, his phone, mountaineering boots, and crampons. He brought no rope, harness, protective gear, headlamp, emergency shelter, or first aid supplies. Forecasts for the Khumbu region indicated mild early season temperatures, while conditions in the western CWM were expected to reach extreme levels under direct sun due to the solar oven effect of the surrounding peaks, only dropping significantly once the sun moved behind the ridges. The load already told you a lot about how he was thinking about this. Just 2 liters of water for a long push through steep ice, mixed terrain, and that thin air kind of altitude where everything feels harder than it should. In conditions like that, most experienced climbers would have carried way more water and better insulation just because you burn through both faster than you expect. Malachi had spent the last 3 weeks in the Khumbu, moving back and forth between base camp and the lower camps as part of a loosely organized commercial expedition. He did his acclimatization, rotations, reached Camp 2 twice, even spent a few nights around 21,000 feet. From the outside, he looked pretty steady, like he knew what he was doing. He got frustrated with the whole system, the slow pace of the fixed ropes, the bottlenecks, people moving slower than he thought they should. On the morning of the attempt, he left Camp 2 early, ostensibly for a solo acclimatization hike toward the base of the face. He moved away from the tents at a steady pace, conserving energy while orienting himself across the glacier toward the Lhotse face. The surface underfoot alternated between firm, wind-packed snow and harder sections of ancient glacier ice. He paused briefly near the transition into the lower face, where the glacier began to tilt upward into the massive ice wall. The ice surface here appeared more consolidated, the slope less broken than the sections farther out on the glacier, giving the impression of a manageable entry into the climb. He consumed a small portion of his water, ate an energy gel, adjusted his boots and crampons, and began the ascent. The first section of the lower Lhotse face requires movement through a steepening ice slope, shaped by flow and wind, using crampon placements, ice axe security, and controlled footwork to gain elevation while reading subtle changes in slope angle and ice hardness. He intentionally left the fixed rope corridor early in the ascent, believing the established route was unnecessarily indirect. The variation he chose appeared steeper but more direct, and he viewed it as a shortcut rather than a meaningful increase in risk. Based on his subsequent movement and recovery location, investigators and experienced climbers reconstructed the same sequence of events. The line he chose gets steeper as it goes. The ice becomes harder and more brittle too, not as supportive, more like surfaces you have to trust through precise crampon bite and body tension rather than anything you can really lock into. It turns into more of a continuous push upward, compared to the standard route, which follows a series of lower angle zigzags and has established platforms to rest.
It's a different kind of terrain entirely. Not harder in a clean way, just less forgiving in every direction, from what I could tell.
The off-route terrain on this section trends toward more technical mixed difficulty, meaningfully harder than the moderate ice rating Malachi had cited as evidence of the route's appropriateness for his solo attempt. He was managing it. He was a strong climber by gym standards, and he was managing the moves. He continued upward. By mid-morning, Malachi had gained several hundred feet of elevation above the western CWM, moving deeper into the technical ice of the face.
Basic Everest logistics before arriving in Nepal.
Had already consumed a significant portion of his water-equivalent supply and was on terrain that did not match the intended line. The position he was in was already becoming more complicated to reverse than he likely understood, with no natural rest features and increasing exposure as the face fully transitioned into direct, high-altitude sun. The heat change in the western CWM is not gradual in any meaningful sense. As the sun angle rises, solar radiation is trapped by the surrounding walls, creating an intense solar oven effect that alters the surface ice structure, weakening the upper layers in exposed sections and making crampon placement progressively less reliable, even when air temperatures remain low. Most experienced Himalayan climbers internalize this over time. They account for it in pacing, route choice, and movement decisions, especially on temperature-sensitive ice. Malachi had not accumulated enough experience on sustained high-altitude routes in exposed conditions without rope protection to develop that calibration in a meaningful way. If he perceived the change in the mountain, there was no indication it altered his decisions.
I've been on similar slopes in the afternoon sun, and you can actually feel how quickly the surface stops behaving the way it did an hour earlier. It doesn't ease you into it.
Later in the climb, he reached a broad, broken transition zone, an uneven mix of rock outcrops and hard blue ice, not part of the main route line. He stopped there briefly. 2 photographs from this position were later recovered from his phone, marking a short rest before he continued upward. His hands showed visible abrasion in the photos from the rougher alpine rock and ice interface, basically the kind of surface wear you get when you've been on more abrasive mixed terrain than your hands and gloves are really accustomed to. The actual intended route is more consistent in comparison with better defined placements that are a bit more predictable on the hands and tools. Off-route, the texture is more demanding and more consuming. The abrasions on Malachi's hands in those photographs are not dramatic. They are the ordinary, small injuries of a climber working unfamiliar terrain. They are also a measurement of something.
I keep coming back to those photos. Nothing about them looks extreme on their own, but put in context of where he was, they feel heavier than they should.
From the ledge, looking upward, the terrain above him presented an extended, near-vertical ice and rock-faced section open, without the guidance of fixed ropes that would give him an obvious line to follow, with small features requiring precise footwork, crampon placement, and reliance on mixed terrain technique. The face did not offer obvious features. It was not a blank slope, but it was close enough to one that the eye, searching for the next sequence, would have had to work for it. He looked down. Beneath him, the ice slope he had ascended over the preceding hours, the sequence of body positions, counterbalance movements, and careful step and axe placements he had used to gain altitude, was now a series of moves that would have to be reversed to retreat. Downclimbing steep blue ice is not a simple inversion of climbing it. The body positions change, the direction of force changes. Moves that were managed going up with gravity assisting the foot placements and the hips angling naturally into the ice, became awkward and strained going down. Without a rope, without protection, a single failed foothold on the descent would produce the same outcome as a failed foothold on the ascent. He was approximately several hundred feet above the glacier floor. Malachi looked up again. He continued upward. By this point, the climb had stopped feeling like a sequence of individual moves and had become a continuous commitment upward.
It's more like, from my perspective, all the changes start taking effort at once.
Every short rest was conditional on the next usable feature appearing above him, and every attempt to reassess the route required letting go of positions that already demanded full effort to maintain. The further he progressed, the less the terrain offered any clear pause points where a decision could be made without physical cost. What would normally be a moment to stop, downclimb, or reorient on a roped climb instead became a simple mechanical reality. Stopping meant hanging sustained weight on marginal holds, and going down required reversing movements that were no easier than what lay ahead. In that narrowing space between upward progress and downward uncertainty, the climb gradually lost clear, low-consequence decision points. What he was thinking at this point, whether he had assessed the situation and chosen to continue because the upward option appeared more manageable than the downward one, or whether he was not yet fully processing the logic of his position, cannot be known with certainty. Both explanations have been offered by climbers who have reviewed the timeline. Both may be partially correct. What is known is that he moved upward. One energy gel remained in his pack. He was somewhere above 900 feet on the face, on off-route terrain, in direct sun exposure, where solar radiation affected surface conditions despite the high altitude and persistent wind. The surface temperature, at this point estimated by reference to ambient temperature data, the slope's angle and orientation, and the absence of any shade features in the area where he was climbing, would have been significantly elevated for ice and exposed rock. Ice quality at that temperature degrades quickly, becoming brittle or dinner plating under repeated load, while mixed sections begin to lose consistency in their bindings. The process of sustained step, plant, weight transfer, and rebalance over several hours of climbing in these conditions produces a cumulative degradation in stability that most experienced Himalayan climbers are familiar with in the abstract, even if few have tested it to the extreme. Malachi was now testing it. He was covering significantly less vertical ground per hour than his earlier pace suggested. He had no water. He was dehydrated, at extreme altitude, in thin air, with an unknown quantity of vertical terrain remaining above him, and a descent path behind him that had already become difficult to consider seriously.
I got the sense that even looking down didn't really solve anything anymore.
The correct route, with its fixed ropes, its engineered platforms, its predictable difficulty, was somewhere to his right, separated from his position by terrain he could not now safely cross. He had been off-route, without knowing it, for more than 3 hours.
The mountain did not offer a way to correct this. This is where it stops feeling like he's on a climb and starts feeling like, from where I'm seeing it, he's just stuck working upward because down doesn't look clean either.
Malachi arrived at a 3-5 foot face section that represented the next obstacle between his current position and whatever terrain lay above. The stance beneath him was narrow and sloped outward enough that any loss of inward pressure naturally shifted weight away from the wall rather than into it. Instead, it required continuous inward pressure against the ice to maintain balance, with the climber relying on crampon bite, ice axe security, and body tension rather than any flat footing. The terrain above rose into near vertical mixed ground with small, sloping features that depended heavily on friction and precise tool placements. Under normal conditions, the sequence would be managed with rested forearms, more reliable ice, and protection from a fixed rope to reduce consequence in the event of a slip. None of those conditions existed for Malachi. He was fully dehydrated after hours of sustained off-route movement in direct sun. His forearms were heavily pumped, the result of prolonged muscular fatigue that reduces grip strength and does not recover quickly with rest. He remained on a sloping, outward-angled stance
Not research
that required
basic Everest
constant
logistics before
muscular
arriving in
engagement
Nepal.
simply
Her
to
focus
stay
on
in position. The ice and rock above him were near peak daytime warmth, and the effectiveness of his grip was reduced by heat transfer, moisture, and accumulated fatigue. What he faced was not a graded climbing problem in the way gym systems define difficulty. It was a sequence of movements requiring precise technical execution on small, unreliable features above an unstable stance, under conditions that steadily degraded physical capacity. The classification could be written down, but it did not reflect the accumulated demands of the situation. It was a problem only in form, not in function. Malachi began the section. He climbed the first 22 feet without stopping. The movement was controlled, but increasingly marginal, requiring deliberate weight shifts and full commitment to each foothold.
I won't sugarcoat it. Every move there asks for more trust than it looks like it should. More than it appears to at first glance.
Every placement demanded precision, as the mixed features offered minimal margin for error and required constant adjustment of body position and tool security to maintain contact with the mountain. At 22 feet above the stance, he paused and held position. His right foot was on a sloping ice foothold. His left hand was on a side pull, feature a rock hold that runs vertically and is gripped from the side rather than from above, requiring the arm to pull laterally rather than downward. Above him, in the range of what his arms could reach without committing his feet to the next sequence, there was nothing that registered as better than what he currently had. The next sequence of movement upward was not obvious. The features above, such as they were small, sloping, and offered no clear resting position.
I've been in enough footage reviews to know that when nothing better shows up above you, your brain starts negotiating with itself fast, and not always in helpful ways.
He had been in that position for somewhere between 30 and 40 seconds. The sequence of what follows is reconstructed from physical evidence, the testimony of climbers at Camp 2, and the biomechanical analysis contained in the subsequent reports. At some point during those 30 to 40 seconds, with no move available above him and no safe option clearly visible below him, his grip quality already at the functional limit of what dehydrated, fatigue-weakened forearm muscles can sustain began to fail in a way that could be measured, in practical terms, in the gradual outward drift of his fingers on the hold.
That quiet slip in the fingers is something I always find hard to picture in real time. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but it changes everything.
He tried to lower his right foot to the hold below it to undo a single step and find a position from which he might be able to rest his grip or identify a different sequence or simply gain a moment of additional stability. This is a reasonable instinct. On a gym wall, with fresh arms, with a rope above him, it is a routine response to reaching a dead end. Here, it was a movement that required his left hand to sustain full load while his right foot searched for a placement below and behind it, on a sloping surface, on exposed ice, 22 feet above a stance that angled outward toward open air. At a critical moment on the mountain, Malachi's right foot slipped from the sloping ice foothold, causing his full weight to transfer instantly to his remaining points of contact. His left hand already operating at its limit after hours of sustained climbing and high-altitude heat and fatigue was unable to maintain grip under the sudden load shift. It released, and he fell. He fell 22 feet and struck the sloping stance below him, a narrow platform angled at approximately 20 to 25 degrees outward from the face. The impact did not arrest his fall. The angled stance partially deflected his impact, reducing vertical force momentarily but failing to arrest the fall. His body lost contact with the surface almost immediately and continued off the outer edge. He came to rest on a small bench of broken rock and compacted ice partway down the face. The fall was not directly witnessed. 2 climbers at Camp 2 noticed unusual movement and debris shedding from a section of the face where no teams were currently climbing. They described it as a significant amount of material dislodged from a high shelf. They attempted to locate the source but could not see the area clearly due to the scale of the terrain and intervening features. They briefly discussed it, assumed it was a natural ice fall, a common occurrence on the Lhotse face, and continued with their activities. One of them kept glancing back up the wall, unsettled by the feeling that the debris pattern didn't match typical rock or ice shedding. Later that day, a Sherpa team returning to Camp 2 noticed a single daypack and gear near the base of an unroped section that had not been there in the morning. Reviewing the expedition logs and permit records, authorities found only one climber missing from the morning's roster, the solo climber who had ostensibly gone for an acclimatization hike. Concerned by the combination of details, they initiated a search. The following search efforts confirmed a motionless figure on a debris shelf high on the face. Recovery operations were delayed by terrain and fading light and were suspended until the following morning when a long-line recovery team reached the location and confirmed the climber was deceased. The subsequent reports concluded that the cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with a multi-stage fall from height. The injuries indicated an initial impact that redirected the body outward from the slope, followed by a second, more severe impact onto lower rock and ice debris. The reports noted multiple fractures and severe internal and cranial trauma consistent with high-energy impacts. It also confirmed the absence of any protective equipment or connection to the fixed lines.